Alrighty, let's go ahead and begin today's event. Thank you all for joining a new entry in the APS Government Research Funding and Policy webinar series. Today's special event, it's titled Psychological Science and Education Research Funding Opportunities at NSF and IES. My name is Andy DeSoto. I'm the Director of Government Relations at APS. And if you aren't familiar with the Association for Psychological Science, well, we are an international organization of 30,000 individuals that are dedicated to advancing research psychology for the benefit of science and society. We hope you're thinking about attending the APS virtual convention that's at the end of May. If you want to learn more, go to psychologicalscience.org. If you're interested in research at the intersection of psychological science and education, you're in the right place today. You're about to hear from some of the key funders of this work across two US federal organizations, the National Science Foundation and the Institute of Education Sciences. If you're like me, you'll be really wowed to hear the depth and breadth of some of the work that our special guests today support. So let me introduce our three speakers. First, Dr. Erin Higgins. She's a program officer at the Institute for Education Sciences, or IES. She manages the cognition and student learning programs, as well as the transformative research in the education sciences program. She's a cognitive psychological scientist by training, and she has been at IES for about 8 years. Next, Dr. Rob Oxendorf is a program officer at the National Science Foundation, NSF, in NSF's Division of Research on Learning. His background is in math and science education. He was previously at IES for 9 years and has been at NSF for 5. His main portfolios include DRK-12, that's Discovery Research Pre-K to 12, and the Education and Human Resources Core Learning Programs, in part focusing on research related to individuals with disabilities. Also, Dr. Gregg Solomon is a program officer at NSF, also in NSF's Division of Research on Learning. He's a psychological scientist, and his background is in cognitive and developmental psychology. He's a scholar of expert novice differences in how kids learn biology and math. He's also involved in a variety of cross-directorate initiatives at NSF. Like Rob, he also oversees research in the DRK-12 and core learning programs. He's also been involved in NSF Science of Learning initiatives and its integrative understanding of neural and cognitive systems work. His current research is on interdisciplinarity. Before we get started, just a few quick logistical details. So today's webinar will be 60 minutes in length. So you know, as participants, your cameras and mics will be off for this session. If you do have questions for the panelists, which we encourage, please make use of the question and answer box. It's at the bottom of the screen, and use that to submit your questions. Most of the questions we aim to answer in between our panelists' presentations, as well as at the conclusion of their comments. Today's event, it'll be recorded. A video and a write-up will be made available to you, and also our panelists will be able to share their slides with you to review also. So with that, I'll leave it to Erin, Rob, and Greg. Thank you very much. We're excited to hear more.
Thanks, Andy. We're really happy to give this presentation. We take our show on the road from time to time. NSF and IES work pretty well together, mostly. You heard us introduce as program officers. We're program officers, program director, program manager. It often just depends on which agency you're talking about and even which program within an agency, but more or less the same things. We work with folks in the field about putting proposals together, organizing review panels, and making recommendations as to what's to be funded. The space here between and overlapping with psychological science and education research is what we're going to address now. The structure of it is, I'll give a few comments about kind of advice in general or some issues in general about sending the proposals into our agencies and about working in this overlapping multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary space. Rob will have a few words about specific programs at NSF that are relevant, and Erin will tell us about IES. But the bulk of this time, we're really looking to set aside to Q&A, so you can ask more specific questions. All right. So one of the big aspects that comes up, we see this in fields, we see this on our review panels, is that there can often be an us and them aspect to what happens on panels. what happens at conferences, what happens in papers and proposals. You know, again, gross characterization, but maybe not too exaggerated, is a lot of psychological scientists, when they think about work within education, the education research community, they kind of dismiss the intellectual heavy lifting that's required. You know, then, as I say here, applying learning research to practice, it's mere engineering, right? As if engineering were mere engineering. But the idea is they haven't necessarily come to grapple with some of the really tough methodological and intellectual problems that have to be solved. Meanwhile, you often get from educational researchers this notion of psychologists as doing work that has really nothing to do with practice, unimportant questions, you know, you logical positivists, you. Then we also get as well folks in the domain disciplines, biology, chemistry, physics, as referred to at NSF. And the thing that gets my blood boiling is they often talk about, if only had real scientists involved, as if, right? So a lot of what goes on, a lot of the difficulties come in that some of the problems are not necessarily inherent to psychology and education, but it really has to do with just the nature of interdisciplinarity, of getting different literatures, different communities to work together. There is this assumption that it's good in and of itself to do interdisciplinary work. That may or may not be the case, but it's clearly the case within education, educational issues, that there are a lot of topics that come up that are really overdue for collaboration, that within psychology and within education, it's often the case that you'll get people working on the same issue at the same grain size, unaware of each other's literatures. Nonetheless, there are real costs of the research doing this. It takes a while in interdisciplinary work to really work out with somebody from another field how to talk to each other, how to merge the kinds of methodologies that you approach. There are career risks. There's literature shows there's delay in publication. Once publications are out, they often have a really big bang, but there are individual risks. It might not get you tenure, or might be a delay. And we're here to talk a lot about some of the funding challenges. With all the talk given to how important interdisciplinary work is, sometimes quite the opposite is how it plays out on review panels. So the question, where to submit? Again, these are all common sense, but it's amazing how little common sense points often hold up funding. So where should you send your proposals? Who should fund this? And one of the big issues is, who do you think will care about what the output in? You know, what literatures are you working in? When you start looking at specific programs, look at who else they've funded. Go to their websites. Look in journal articles, the acknowledgements. If it's a paper in an area that you're studying, what funding sources do they acknowledge? And you know, this happens less than one would think, but if you have colleagues who have gotten awards or declines, if they'll give them to you, take a look at them. You'll know where they went. You'll see the kind of feedback they got back. Something else that's important is you want to look at the review panels and kind of what fields are represented. In education, some of the panels that we have will have folks all from education. It might be all math educators, or it might be half psychology, half education. There might be physicists. You might have statisticians. You can find out about this. Erin can tell you a bit about IES, but in a lot of NSF programs, the program gets hundreds of proposals coming in, and we break them up into sub-panels. And on each sub-panel is how the review comes out. You can talk to program officers about the kinds of review panels and the kind of panel it might end up on. Again, is it multidisciplinary? Will they know your literature? They might and they might not. Do you have a sense of who the kinds of people are on the panel and what kind of literatures that they represent? But again, one of the big points is, even within a program, panel cultures can differ, and that has tremendous implications for how you actually write the proposal, right? You want to have some audience in mind. So some aspects that vary by program, again, are what literatures are reviewed in a proposal. If you're sending to a program, for example, it's the developmental psychology program at NSF, pretty much everybody's going to be a developmental psychologist. And so the literature review you do at the beginning of a proposal can be pretty brief, because as with a journal article, you have to allude to a topic, and folks will understand what's behind it, ostensibly. When it's multidisciplinary, they might not even have heard of your question, let alone your literature. These are things to take in mind in doing the writing. What kind of methodologies are being used? Is this familiar? How much do you write about methodology? How much of the proposal do you devote to analyses? Again, this is aside from the actual work you're doing, is what do you put in the proposal itself? Huge variation in this. Again, ask, you can find these things out. Is pilot testing required? Is it expected? Budget sizes vary hugely. Programs vary enormously. You might find programs where the average award might be 80,000, 100,000. Others where it's 2 million, 3 million, often for similar work. Find out. You look weird if you're either too high or too low. Find out, take a look at what's going on. Another big variation is after your proposal has gone through and it might be funded, in some programs, you can actually engage in some negotiation with the program officers. Good to know. Again, some obvious but unappreciated advice is when you're writing for our programs at NSF, you have 15 pages to describe your project. What a task to do when some people will know your literature cold and are expecting tremendous detail, almost journal article level detail about what you're going to do. Somebody else on the panel might have, again, never heard of the question, never heard of your literature. In 15 pages, can you satisfy both? At some level, no, you have to be vague about something. So part of the game, part of the art of writing a proposal is what to be vague about, right? Some things you're going to have to lay out on. And the key is, are these critical elements of what you're proposing? Can they evaluate it? You don't want somebody saying, for example, if it's a Cogneuro program, and we'll do the statistics to analyze the images, right? I mean, that's the game. They're just, in one sentence telling you what the whole project is turning on. My guess as a reviewer who knows that literature would not like it. In other areas, it's understood. You don't have to go on about it. These are often not blind, and so it could be the case that you've already done work in that area. They can assume it. Another big thing, especially for psychologists coming in an education program, you want to make the implications for translation clear, but you don't want to oversell it, right? So my own work, for example, was in folk biology, what little kids understand about the biological world, biological phenomena. To me, seems completely obvious that there's implications for education. You've got to make some of these things explicit because folks from another world, another literature might not grasp the fact that what those implications are. But this advice I give carefully because then people I tell this to, you see their proposal and they completely oversell it. We're going to change math ed as it's known. And you look at them, or a reviewer looks at them and says, what do you know about math ed? Often it's either ignorance of another literature, insulting folks in another literature, or really failing to engage how much more work needs to be done before this will hit practice. So make the implications clear. Often make it clear who the stakeholders are, should you affect. It might be that what comes out of your project is going to affect other literatures, other researchers, developers, folks who do scaling up research and so on, or just more fundamental or basic research. Your call, but make it clear who should care about what comes out of this. The other is, as I say here, consider those tired middle-aged eyes reading quickly. We tell people not to read the proposals on the airplane coming to the panel. Sometimes it happens, a lot of times it happens. So don't assume that this is going to be read necessarily that carefully and they're going to hang on every word, right? If something is important, you really want to highlight it because they could really miss things. Too bad for you. Exposition matters. Don't play games with spacing. Get the ideas in there. But remember, these are human beings who are reading these things and they're tired. So just write it. Get the points across. Again, for psychologists, your proposals might end up on panels where people don't know the specific psychology literature that you're talking. So you have to write this at a couple levels for people who do know your literature and for people who don't necessarily know it. We say that all literatures are equal. The point is what you have to know for the question, what's important for your question. The fact is, it's very often the case that reviewers will see education literature as primary. If a psychologist ignores a finding in education, that can be fatal. If someone from the education world doesn't know about something that's in the psychological literature, so what? You can't know everything, right? Unfair perhaps, but this is a reality of sending proposals in, and we see this playing out. Something that we as program officers often do post-panel in deciding what to recommend for funding is say, so what? Let's say the project works out exactly the way the PI says it will. They get the data they're expecting. So what? Who cares? What kind of effect will this have? Make that clear in the proposal, okay? And again, another thing in education is make that there are real methodological and analytic differences. One big one, for example, if you're going after, let's say, a really complex issue, very, very involved, multifactorial. In psychology, the way certainly I was trained is I might propose 10 different studies that are logically interrelated, 10 little beautifully balanced studies, and the logic comes out in the connection of those 10 little studies. In education, for example, you might find doing one giant ecologically valid study. Very different ways of approaching, again, not necessarily, but very different ways of approaching problems. And the expectations that reviewers take are along those lines as well. What kinds of claims can you make? What is warranted? We are open to a range of different methodologies, but it's got to be the kind of thing that can you warrant the kinds of claims that you want to make. Another little thing is, if you're unsuccessful in your proposal and we decline it, that does not necessarily mean go away forever, right? We fund, I think most of the proposals that we fund have previously been declined, right? It's amazing how many people don't come back when 2 months, 6 months of hard work, there could be $1 million on the other end for you. If it's worth doing, it's worth submitting. Call up the program officer, contact them. They should be happy to go through these with you. Again, we can't break confidentiality, but we can look at some of these. And when you look over the reviews, it could be that the reviewer was correct. What they pointed out as a flaw was a flaw, and the proposal was correctly declined. And good for you. Opportunity lost had you done it incorrectly. It could be as well that the reviewer was correct. You might disagree about the way they weight this flaw, right? It's a minor thing that's easily addressed in the flow of research. That's noise in the system, perhaps something about exposition as well. You can make it clear that these things can be addressed. Sometimes the reviewers are right that this is something that's important, but it's a concern that you had identified in the proposal and you're angry. I talked about that on page 8, paragraph 3, 2 lines up from the bottom. Sorry, they missed it. If it's that important, now you know how to highlight it. And sometimes the reviewers are just wrong, right? They just didn't get it. We apologize. This happens. We try to keep things as transparent as we can. We don't want just the same old people reviewing all the proposals. And sometimes we bring in folks who just didn't get it. Now, here's the thing. Don't necessarily think that some idiotic review is the reason your proposal was declined. Talk to us. It could be that we looked at that and thought it was a bad review as well and ignored it, just didn't weight it. You might want to know that. And we can say things like, this review here, that's the top person in the field. This is somebody who I'm sure you value highly. Pay attention to that feedback. Finally, here's a call. We need reviewers, which is a great way to get to know a program. You get to see other proposals, see how people put them together. You get to hear the kinds of comments that other reviewers from different fields make. Very enlightening. An even better way to get to know a program is to be a program officer. We're always looking for new folks to come in. At NSF, you can come in permanently, or you can come in as a rotator. You can come in for 1 or 2 years and then go back to your institution. And please recommend people to us to be on panel or to serve as program officers. A lot of these ideas we touched on in an article that Rob and I and 2 colleagues, Karen King and Barry Sloan, wrote. And there's a citation for it. Rob, you want to say a word or 2 about NSF?
Sure. Thanks, Greg. Just real quickly. This is the overall structure of NSF. generally divided into what we call directorates, or 7 directorates, kind of set up a little bit like a university. School of this, school of that. Gregg and I are in the Education and Human Resources Directorate. I'll talk a little bit about some of the programs there. And then the other directorate of interest is the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate, potentially to this crowd. Okay. So within the Education Directorate, Gregg and I sit in the division that's on the upper right there in blue, Division of Research on Learning in Formal and Informal Settings. There's also an Undergraduate Education Directorate. So if some of your work is touching on how undergraduates are learning in a STEM discipline, that could be relevant. But, and then there's also the Division of Graduate Education and the Division of Human Resource Development. I'm told that we're undergoing some sort of reorganization or renaming. And so some of this may change in about, who knows, a year or 2 or longer. Next, thanks. Okay, and so then a couple programs that, well, there's several here. Gregg and I work mostly in the first 2, which is the EHR Core Research Program, which is a bit more basic, fundamental research. I'm gonna drop a link into the chat where you can click on and see what we have funded recently in that program to give you a sense of the kinds of projects that we consider to be sort of more basic, fundamental. DRK-12 is a much more applied program. So the idea is that you're doing research that will have kind of a more direct impact on practice in schools. Then there's what we call the Azo Program, which is kind of like DRK-12, except outside of schools. So informal learning kinds of settings, museums, zoos, aquariums, podcasts, movies, all sorts of things that are outside of school. Improving undergraduate STEM education, which I referenced, has to do with, it's kind of like DRK-12, but at the undergraduate level. And then within SBE, I think Gregg works in Cogneuro, right, Gregg? And a little bit in Science of Learning, yeah?
I have been, I often sit in on developmental science and the perception, action, cognition panels as well.
And so, these are the programs in SBE that might be of interest to this crowd. And, we talk regularly to program officers who work in those programs. There are often proposals that cut across, and, we do have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we support projects. And so, there could be co-funding that goes on between programs across directorates, that sort of thing. But these, in the slides that get sent around, all of these links are active, and they will take you to the landing page for each of those programs where you can learn a bit about them. There's also cross-directorate programs, Neural and Cognitive Systems, NCS we call it, and a kind of new program, REDL, which is a replacement of what was previously called cyber learning. And then there's the Includes program, which has to do with essentially diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM fields. And that's it, I think, for NSF. Gregg, anything else you want to tack on to that? You're muted.
There we go. Nope. Again, this is where it really matters where you send a proposal. A lot of people, here's a big question, I'll just jump into it. A lot of people ask about sending a proposal to multiple programs. NSF allows that. Talk to the program officers first. Sometimes that's fine. If you want to send it to Cogneuro, and developmental, that's fine. That's an obvious mix. But something to EHR and to SBE can be dangerous, because to appeal to 2 very different kinds of panels, you often end up appealing to nobody. So talk to us before you do that, but it is completely allowed.
Stop sharing, Gregg, I guess, for Erin.
Yeah. He's changing the slides over.
Great.
All right. Thanks, Gregg and Rob, for a good introduction to all the issues. I think that Gregg offered some really fantastic advice that applies to IES work as well in terms of thinking about how to frame a proposal and the kinds of issues to think about when it comes to getting something successfully through the review process. I'll just add a couple of things before I get started on talking about a high-level overview of IES funding, and say, you know, if you're a psychological science scientist who has not yet gone into the education research space and you're thinking about it, but you're not sure, I just offer for you the idea that I think a lot of the theories that we generate as psychologists in the lab, you know, we have this idea that down the road they'll make an impact, and so we, you know, whittle away at that theory in a lab study or a set of lab studies to really figure out what are the factors that matter and how is knowledge represented and all of these things. And without testing it in the real world, I think you're missing out on ways that that theory could be enriched and even revised to really reflect those real world conditions and factors that matter. You know, and if your goal is to generate a theory that does inform downstream, you know, some sort of real world situation, why not start testing it there? So I think that these programs we're talking about today are a really great opportunity to secure some funding and build out an interdisciplinary team to really start taking these basic science principles and theories and testing them in these real world situations, and then finding maybe it doesn't work exactly as you'd predicted, and then go back to the lab and revise the theory there. So there's value to both the basic science parts of our field and for the applied parts in doing this kind of work. So I hope that excites you enough to come and start engaging in conversations with us to think about how your work might fit in. So again, today I'm going to give you a pretty high-level overview of funding at the Institute of Education Sciences, but hopefully in the Q&A we can talk a little bit more about specific programs, and I'm always happy to talk through email about your ideas and find a good fit for your work. So Greg, you can go to the next slide. As you've already heard, I think a theme coming through here is that in order to be successful as an applicant, you really need to understand the mission of the agency, but also in the case of NSF, like really the program that you're applying to. And so here that's true as well. Your goal, I think, is to find the right agency or program that aligns best to your goals as a researcher, and then also to make sure that your application, that the language you use and the framing really aligns well to the mission of the agency. So IES is the Statistics, Research, and Evaluation arm of the U.S. Department of Education. We are nonpartisan by law and charged with providing rigorous and relevant evidence on which to ground education practice and policy. And then we also have the charge of sharing that broadly with education stakeholders. And these are a wide range of stakeholders, including educators, parents, policymakers, researchers, and the public. So if you were to receive a grant from us, an expectation that we have for you is that you take the findings from your work and you share it widely with people who could actually benefit from it, not just, you know, in the traditional publications that you're accustomed to doing. So you'll see as part of our application process, we have a dissemination plan section of the application where your job is to think about how you can provide this information that's coming out of your project to all of these different stakeholder groups. Okay, next slide. Here's our organizational structure. So we are led by a director who's currently Dr. Mark Schneider. He has, I believe, 3 years remaining on his term. It's a 6-year term. And then he is advised by the National Board for Education Sciences. And then within IES, we have the Office of Science, who oversees our peer review process. And they, importantly, are separated from the centers that actually provide the research funding to PIs like yourself. And the reason that that separation is important is because it allows program officers who are in charge of the various grant programs I'm going to talk about to be really collaborative with you in the proposal writing process. So we can have phone calls with you where we talk about your idea and help you better align it to the program, make sure that you are aware of and understand the requirements for the competition. And then we can also even do things like read a draft of your proposal and provide you some comments, because we're separate from the actual review process that takes place. So then we also have 4 centers. So the National Center for Education Statistics is the federal entity in charge of collecting and analyzing data related to education. The National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance conducts large-scale evaluations of education programs supported by federal funds, and then provides technical assistance and supports the development and use of research and evaluation on a national scale. And then finally, in blue, we have 2 research centers. These are the ones I'll focus on today, that manage our external discretionary grants programs for researchers. So the National Center for Education Research and the National Center for Special Education Research. And I am in the National Center for Education Research, and I have colleagues in the Special Education Research Center, or NICSR, who do similar kinds of work as me, but focused on students with or at risk for disabilities. So the objectives of the programs that we fund are typically the following. So we want to develop or identify education interventions, which we very broadly define as practices, programs, policies, and approaches that enhance education outcomes and that can be widely deployed. I think critically, it's important in this conversation where NSF is involved to say that we really focus on more formal education settings. So work that happens in museums and in these informal contexts typically doesn't work within IES programs. There might be some exceptions to that, but for the most part, the work that we do really focuses on what's happening in school, what's happening at the local and state education agencies. Another goal is to identify what works and what does not work, and thereby encourage innovation and further research. We also want to understand the processes that underlie the effectiveness of interventions, and then variation in that effectiveness, either due to some local context or individual differences. And then finally, we want measures to be developed of academic achievement and other kinds of factors that affect student progress through the system. So next, I'll just talk through what some of these funding opportunities look like, with the caveat that we're between solicitations. So I'll talk about what we competed already within the last year, and then we should be announcing our new round of solicitations within the next month or 2. So keep an eye out on this funding page, which I have a link to right here. It's just ies.ed.gov/funding. All right. And on the next page, I'll give you some other tips for how to find out more about our solicitations once they're out. So the best way is to sign up for the IES newsflash, which is just ies.ed.gov/newsflash. You can also navigate to it directly from our funding page, I believe. The newsflash will go out about each funding solicitation we announce immediately on the day that it gets announced. So that's the best and fastest way to find out more. We also post information in the Federal Register, so you can keep an eye on that. And then that funding opportunities page I showed you is again, another place where we update regularly. Once you identify a competition you'd like to apply to, review the request for applications and our application submission guide for the specific requirements, and then contact the program officer. Like I said, we can be really helpful to you throughout the whole process, and there are many resources we can provide you with as you figure out how to navigate the complex system of programs we have. Okay, next page. Yeah, so there's our funding opportunities page, and on the next slide, you'll also see that that has tons of resources for you to get started before you even engage with a program officer, including on-demand webinars and links to various documents. So I would encourage all of you to go there and click around. Okay, so like I said, because we're between solicitations, what I'm going to do is talk about what we've done over the last year, and you can assume that some subset of these are going to be recompeted in the coming couple of months. And in particular, the Education Research Grants Competition through NCER is probably the main program that people on this webinar are going to be the most interested in. Within that, we have the Cognition and Student Learning program that I've been managing and that actually has been around since 2002. So through that, we've funded 175 projects, most of which are guided by psychological scientists. So it's a wonderful program to bridge what we know about the science of learning and education practice and kind of iterate between lab and classroom. There's also the social and behavioral context for academic learning program within there, where I think a lot of psychologists also find a good home. So there are a number of places within this education research grants competition where I think psychology research just makes a lot of sense. Again, with the caveat, I think that it's important to think about an interdisciplinary team so that you're very well versed in the education issues that you're going to be grappling with as you do this work. Some other programs that I think could be of interest to this group would be the Transformative Research in the Education Sciences program, which is new this year. Within that program, the goal is to identify highly innovative and potentially impactful research that we can fund. It's a really exciting program. There are fewer requirements in this program than there are in the Education Research Grants program to allow for a lot of creativity in terms of researchers coming up with innovative product ideas or ways to do research. So I'd be happy to talk more about that. Again, this is the first year we're doing it, but we anticipate recompeting that in the future. And then we also do a number of one-off competitions like research and development centers and research networks focused on areas of priority from the Institute. So this past year, we did a research network on digital learning platforms and their role in research. So there are these interesting areas that we will stand up competitions from year to year around. And so those you'll just kind of have to keep an eye on from our funding page. And if there's something that fits with your work, absolutely reach out to the program officer to talk about it more. And there's just so much you can do across all of these programs. I think that's the thing I want to emphasize. I think a lot of people, if they know about IES, they think immediately about efficacy research. But in fact, we fund research across a spectrum of things, from very exploratory work, really trying to understand what kinds of study strategies are working optimally in classrooms, to developing something novel, whether it's a novel education technology or some aspect of a curriculum or an instructional approach, to the efficacy studies that most people think about when they think of IES. And then finally, we even support assessment development work, so validating assessments, developing new assessments. So there's just lots of things that you can do. And I think as a first step, contacting the program officer and saying, here are the goals of my research program. Is there anything that fits? And we can help you brainstorm about the best match in terms of a competition. So on the next slide, I have Nixer's 2021 grant opportunities. In 2021, there were 3 research competitions and a research training competition that were run. Again, just like in the last slide, I think for this particular group, the special education research grants competition would be the most likely best fit. It's very similar to the education research grants program that I just described, but the focus is on students with or at risk for disabilities. And again, you can conduct lots of different kinds of research within that program, whether it's the exploratory work or developing a new intervention or testing it for efficacy, and even, again, measurement work. So there's lots of different things that, that one could do. And again, talking to the program officer will be the best way to get started. Okay, next slide. I've already talked through some of this, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. Again, we have lots of resources for applicants. The best one is to just initiate contact with one of us, and we can point you to the other things. New this year, though, we've tried virtual office hours where we'll sit on a video call with a bunch of applicants and just field general questions for an hour, and that's been working really well. We have on-demand webinars, which you can go take a look at right now. And then we even have more specific assistance and resources available, such as cost analysis assistance. So for some of our projects, you need to do cost analyses of the interventions that you're studying, and other resources such as how to think about data sharing and public access to research. Okay, and really quickly, I'll talk about review panels. I think what Gregg talked about earlier was really helpful. For IES, we similarly have different sub-panels depending on the area that you're focused on within your application. So if you were to apply to the Education Research Grants or Special Education Research Grants program, you're likely going to be, your application would go to one of these standing panels that I list here. And it just depends on what it is that you're studying. So if the focus of your work is on a reading intervention, you're likely to go to the Reading, Writing, and Language Development panel. If it's a STEM project, it might go to STEM. And when you talk to a program officer, we will help you navigate that and help you get a sense of what that panel thinks about and the issues that tend to come up in the review. So again, I think that's another reason to talk to one of us early, because we can give you the lay of the land of what the review process looks like and help you navigate that. Go ahead, next slide. These last two slides really just focus on our funding rate to just show you that for the most part, we hover around 10 or 11% funding rate, depending on the year. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. And we tend to get an average of about 500 to 600 applications a year, although it's been a little bit less over the last couple of years. But the funding rates remained pretty consistent between 10 to 15%. On the next slide, you'll see for NICSR, it's a fairly similar funding rate, again, hovering between 12 and 15%, depending on the year. So I think it's good to know that kind of stuff going into these situations, in part for the reason Gregg mentioned that, a lot of times you need to resubmit before you can get that funding, so don't give up if you get a rejection. It's a very competitive process, and we are here to help you navigate what a resubmission might look like and how to best interpret those reviewer comments. So again, like I noted, stay tuned for our fiscal year 22 opportunities. They should be announced soon. And on the last slide, I just have some contact information for myself and some social media links if you're interested. Gregg, you're muted.
All right, there we go. Nothing had come out of my mouth yet, so that's appropriate. We're open for business. I saw a number of questions in the chat about becoming a reviewer. Erin, do you want to talk about how someone becomes a reviewer at IES?
Yeah, so at IES, we have, let's see if I can pull this up. We have a website that I'm going to try and, I think I can drop in the chat. And you just go onto our website and we have an interested in reviewing part of it where you can go ahead and put in your information, and then our standards and review office will reach out to you if you are a good fit for one of the programs. So I'm dropping that in right now in the chat, and that's going to be your best way to become a reviewer. And we'd love to have you. We need reviewers. We always need reviewers.
Rob, you want to talk about how NSF does it?
Yeah, so basically program officers at NSF are responsible for setting up panels that they need. And it's driven a lot by the proposals that we receive. So Gregg talked about us receiving, hundreds of proposals. They get sorted into various areas, math cognition, educational neuroscience, whatever the case may be. But depending on what's on the panel in terms of proposals, program officers will begin to assemble the necessary expertise to review those proposals. And so, generally speaking, I think NSF asks that you send us a CV and kind of a little statement of interest about which programs you want to review in. And then if your services are needed, you will be called.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, obviously look to be a reviewer for a program that you're interested in submitting to.
Mm-hmm.
I find it often helps, in addition to a CV, maybe a paragraph or a few sentences about your areas of reviewing expertise or interest, because it's not always so obvious, and that's helpful. There's another aspect of reviewing at NSF. So you can sit in on a panel, virtual live, in which you would see a range of proposals and hear and read the reviews of the other panelists. You can also be what we call an ad hoc reviewer, which is akin to being a reviewer for a journal. So we invoke these often when a proposal comes in and there might be some aspect, some area of expertise required to review that proposal, and it's not on the panel. And it would be perhaps inappropriate to have that kind of expertise because that would be the only relevant proposal. So we can send a proposal to an ad hoc reviewer and ask them to weigh in on it, and they only review that. And so I often find this to be a good professional development tool, because it's often the case that there are people who will have heard of, read a paper of, somebody has recommended, particularly a junior colleague, and send the proposal, give them a sense for what a proposal looks like, what a review should be like, and then eventually invite them to sit in on a panel where they'd read 7, 10 proposals, whatever. That varies as well.
By the way, guys, I'm still on. I just lost my video, but I am here.
Any other big questions? You guys want to look through chat and see what comes up? Glad it's helpful.
The question by John about how much weight is put on an applicant's previous publications. I'm hesitant to submit because of the level of competition and my relatively, well, this is NSF, I guess. So yeah, I mean, it factors in. You could also think about the NSF career program, which is something that we didn't necessarily touch on, Greg, but basically you're pre-tenure and, you know, if you're thinking about how your CV looks relative to kind of the heavyweights in the field, then maybe the career program might be something a little bit more palatable because you're competing against other people in your field who are at a similar stage of their career, right? So there's that opportunity. And so when you apply to NSF career, that's a summer deadline, usually in July, and then you indicate which program you're applying to. So whether it's ECR or maybe one of the SPE programs, but you say career and then indicate which funding program. That's where the money would come from to support that project. Greg, anything else?
Yeah, something else to add. Erin, you can weigh in too. I mean, you know, team science is a thing increasingly. And you might have ideas and you might team up with somebody, whether senior or junior, who knows the area, can complement your kind of expertise, and might be savvy about writing proposals, not only proposals, say to NSF, but to that program. That's worth gold. They can bring you along, you can work together. Career, unfortunately, I mean, if ever you needed a co-PI, it's right out of the gates. But career is about the individual. So we don't allow co-PIs, but we do allow advisory boards, and these people can collaborate with you as well. I should say one other thing about collaboration and about kind of bridging between fields. I often encourage PIs to get a postdoc in a complementary field. So for example, to a cognitive scientist who's applying, I encourage them to pull in a postdoc from education, somebody who's interested in cognition. You can do a tremendous amount of mentoring if they're interested in your area, again, different literatures, different approaches to questions and so on, and they can help you. They're often worth gold in your lab because they can say, well, we approach this in a very different way, or, oh, you naive psychologist, what you don't know about the classroom. You know, really great stuff. There's really good give and take. So that can be very helpful. Same with advisory boards. It's often really helpful to have somebody on there from a field that you think should know about what you do, but a literature that you don't know well. These folks are great. Another thing about somebody on an advisory panel is most programs allow you to pay them. And if they're going to be paid, it means it's kind of understood that they'll read a draft. So you can put together a draft and send it to them. So again, let's say you're a psychologist studying math cognition. Get somebody from math ed who you think should know about it. Have them come on board and they could read this. And again, if the project gets funded, they'll be great for you. But even before then, they can read it. And one, if they don't understand what the point of your proposal is, man, that's gold, because their identical twin also will not be able to read it and understand it. The other is they might understand it and disagree with you. Now, you don't have to come to their way of thinking about things, but you should know that on the panel, somebody will disagree and you should be able to handle it. Say something about that. Even sometimes just a tip of the hat that there's an issue is good enough. Ignoring a literature, ignoring a controversy implies that you don't know it, and that's bad. Erin, were you going to say something in there? You're muted.
All right, can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, no, I think you captured all of the issues really well. I was just going to echo that I think a lot of the same things apply at IES around both, for early career scholars, bringing on co-PIs who kind of provide a different perspective, but also have some grant management experience is really great. And then having advisory boards to either weigh in on issues that, again, maybe you yourself are not as familiar with and can leverage that advisory board is a wonderful asset to a project, whether you're senior or early career. And then the last thing you said around different literatures and kind of tipping your hat, I totally agree. I find that when there's a personnel critique and it says you really needed a math educator, you'll go back to the significance section list of weaknesses and it'll say, I really wish they had talked about this issue that is pervasive in math education, right? And so it's like those things are very interconnected. So yeah, lots of good points that are relevant for us too.
I see a question in the Q&A from Soo Young Kim about program officers who you're corresponding with. This is going to be a little bit different between IES and NSF. As Rob had said, at NSF, the program officers who you might be talking about putting your proposal together with are also the ones, or they will also be putting panels together and making funding decisions. Now, the thing is, the question is about rotators. You don't know if the person is going to be around, although you can just flat out and ask them if they're going to be involved. But it's very often the case that I will be, for example, talking to someone ahead of time, giving them lots of advice, take it or leave it. And actually that proposal, even though I'm permanent, but it might not end up on my panel. When we do a sort, it might be that, I can only be on so many panels and it might be in somebody else's area of expertise. So you're never assured that that program officer you're talking to is going to be managing beyond then. So again, this is a sense in which you want your proposal to be able to stand alone and be able to speak to a range of different people. Again, look, we get it. These are hard to write when you don't actually have a total bead on the audience. That's really hard. It makes it hard to read these things too for our reviewers. It's tough, right? Because they're reading across a lot of literatures. And if they don't know your field, what's fun, to my mind, is they're kind of set back on, do I trust this? Is this good science? Do I like the logic of it? Even if I don't necessarily know that literature, it's amazing the extent to which you can get a sense that it's a coherent argument and they're making the case for how important this work is and that it's done well. A lot of evaluating these goes on trust too. Do you get it? Do you trust what they're saying? Because it's 15 pages, you can only say so much.
Yeah, so for IES, again, we can read drafts of your applications and provide you with that kind of feedback in a way that NSF program officers, I think, are not able to. But I'll say that one of the main things that I typically comment on across all these drafts that I read is that people are surprisingly not so great at saying what the goals of their project actually look like and what they are within the first 2 or 3 pages of the grant application. So you'll go through 5 or 6 pages of literature review and various points being made, and you still, as a reader, don't know what the actual project idea that's being pitched is. So you can't fit the points that are being made into this broader framework of this is the purpose of this project. So even though NSF program officers can't read a full draft, as you write these things, kind of imagine that might be one of the comments that some of us might be making to you if we could read your full draft, which is, again, kind of hit the reviewer over the head with what the point of the project is, what the point of this whole exercise is, right? At the very beginning, early and often, so that we're not trying to piece together the different pieces of the literature review and points we're trying to make without some sort of broader framework to work with.
Just one more, thank you, Erin. That's great advice. One more comment in the chat about an advisory program. I think Gregg may have mentioned what is typical for NSF proposals is what we call an advisory board or an advisory panel. For a career grant, especially, this is critical. NSF has a requirement called proposals need a mechanism to assess success of the project. And what's typical is to have a 4 to 5 person advisory board that you bring in for 1 or 2 days a year. Think of kind of the leading experts in that area, and you're getting the best advice from the leading scholars on how the work is going, how the data collection, the study, everything along those lines. So that's I think what we intended there with like an advisory board, and that's written into the budget, written into the proposal that they're going to provide you strategic advice and guidance along the way. That's whether you have a career award or kind of like a regular award. We see these advisory boards being very helpful to our projects along the way.
Yeah. Another point I kind of want to hammer, because I tend to hammer points. The difference between your proposal, the project that lies underneath the proposal, and your overarching program of research. And sometimes it's helpful to distinguish among these. Again, the proposal is how the reviewers are going to find out what you're pitching. And we often tell them to kind of look through the proposal to try to really evaluate the project, not so much get hung up on their split infinitives and whatever it is about the exposition. But often it's helpful to talk about somebody's overarching program of research, right? It could be that the question they ask is not so thrilling that's in the proposal, this piece, but in fact, you've got this overarching program for the next 5 or 10 years of your life. This is what you're going after. And man, is that exciting, but not every step is necessarily so exciting. So the onus is on you to make it clear why somebody should care about what the answer to the question is that you're pitching in your proposal, in this project. It's exciting in this larger transformational project worth of work, even if this is small but necessary. Make that case. Again, questions about changes in proposals kind of depends on what program you're talking about. We're not allowed to tell you at this point, if it's not public, we're not allowed to tell you anything about the impending changes. What we can tell you is we can talk about the prior version of it, the last round, and in general, that is really the best guide for what the next version is going to be. Assume in large measure it's going to be the same. If it's not, then at least for NSF, it would be called something else. It would be a different program, right? Different funding program. So just assume it's pretty much going to be the same for us.
Yeah, and for IES, I think, again, best advice would be to look at what is on our webpage right now. We have archived requests for applications from each of our programs, and agree that, like, for the most part, don't expect massive deviation from what's there. But of course, there will be some changes. And so my best recommendation would be to scope out the project generally at this point. And once those new requests for applications come out, look for where there might be some changes or updated requirements and talk to a program officer about what needs to be tweaked about the idea. But for the most part, you can start planning.
I see an interesting question from Jessica Witt, and that is about saying the intellectual merit at PAC is about advancing theory, whereas the so what question was about advancing knowledge about which education strategies are effective. The so what in a lot of education programs, is the intellectual merit as well. Some of the question is, what are you advancing? Now, for example, a program like ECR, we make it clear that, the overarching so what could have to do with impact on practice, But it could also be, look, one of the functions of science is explanation, and a program like ECR is a basic or fundamental research program. We actually don't use the word basic because for a lot of folks, to them that means being in the lab, whereas basic research could happen in real world context, that's fine. But in any case, the immediate bang of it could be in advancing theory, in advancing the literature. We're totally fine. The program is pointed in that direction. But Congress gives us money because this work has implications. As I like to say, the implications of work in ECR, so it's an education program, isn't necessarily on the classroom next Monday. It could be in the classroom in the year 2050. That's fine, right? Long-term stuff, addressing questions whose applications necessarily aren't clear. It isn't clear how they would be applied. That's totally fine. Another point to make, and Erin, you mentioned this, but this also bears repeating. The insight for the work can come from practice, right? This simplistic notion that it's this line from research to practice. Very often the big insights are from practice to research. Chomsky wrote an article a little while ago, meaning probably 30 or 40 years, about how the soft and hard sciences and about how huge transformations, contrary to what people think, the insights come from the soft sciences, and they're more apt to have a big effect on the hard sciences. So again, wherever the insight comes from, it's how you play it out. But you have to make the implications for education clear, but it doesn't have to be in the short term. Guys, see any other burning issues coming through? Again, we encourage you to get in touch with us directly.
Yeah, I think it looks like we've answered most of the questions here.
Just like a final plea, I guess, I think we've seen trends of kind of not as strong of an interest from this field, this community, in terms of applying to our programs. And we remain very interested in funding this kind of work. Our budget picture is looking quite healthy. And the new Congress seems very supportive of basic science research. Even in the prior administration, very supportive, right? So the money is there. We are just looking for good proposals to fund, right, Greg? This is your message.
I mean, my colleagues look at me with suspicion, thinking that, I've got this ulterior motive of slipping cash to psychologists, maybe. Erin, we were talking about this. The numbers of proposals coming to us from psychology is dropping, and we don't know why. One possibility is folks who are interested in it are moving into other fields instead of doing it in psychology. But look, there are insights, approaches, theories, tools in cognitive science that are not being used in these border areas, that are not being used in education, and bringing these into really constructive contact is what we're really looking for. And we encourage it. It's hard to put this stuff together, but we're looking for it.
Yeah, and I would just say if you're somebody who is on the fence about whether to jump into the education research space, remember, it doesn't have to be just you. An interdisciplinary team is going to be such an asset for this kind of work. It is very difficult to do this kind of research in the field, and it takes a larger team, I think, than a lot of the lab-based work that many of us are accustomed to doing. But that's okay, right? And again, it's like, then it's not all on you to figure out how to do it. Surround yourself with people who have different expertise and experience, maybe some people who've done education research before, so that your novel insights and the creativity that you have around thinking about how the theories you're focused on can apply in this interesting space, so that we can start testing those. Because I think there's just so much potential for more psychology work to inform what we're doing in the education space, but it takes a big lift. So don't try and do it by yourself. Talk to people in colleges of education at your university or more broadly, and pull together a strong interdisciplinary team.
Yeah, you know, there's one thing we didn't talk about. It. Andy, I know you're about to put that big cane in to pull us off the stage, but we didn't talk about money. As Rob said, there's a lot of money coming in. And the amount of money we give per grant in EHR, Erin, you can tell us about IES, but the same kind of proposal that would go to SBE versus EHR, again, if you can get it funding, we tend to give, I think their average award size is something like $200,000 or $300,000, whereas our average award size is about 1.5 million for similar work. We have way more money. So take a look at what is entailed. You know, we have enough money so that what you pitch to do it right. Your time, postdoc time, research, if the question is worth doing, we have the cash to support it, to do it right. Sometimes asking for too little money is as bad as asking for too much. So someone might pitch, I'm gonna have 1,000 hours of videotape from a classroom and I need $300 to pay an undergraduate to code these things in a week. Oh, okay, good. You've never done this before, I guess, right? It undermines, you know, not knowing how much is typical is one thing, but the key is, does it undermine their sense that you know the science? But there's money, right? So come on in, swim in our pool.
Yeah, we similarly have award amounts in the like 1.5 to $3-ish million range, depending on the kind of work you're proposing. So hopefully enough to pull together that team I was talking about.
And I mean, the other thing, like the scaling up implementation research, this is even richer, right? Because this work, you have to be in multiple school districts or multiple states or however you're going to do this work. Rob, even in DRK-12, their budgets tend to be larger than in ECR of necessity.
Yeah, up to 5 million for DRK-12. For larger studies, school-based studies, you could be in 3, 4, 5 school districts collecting data from thousands of kids. And so those studies tend to be quite larger budget-wise.
And it's not necessarily harder to get more money, right? It can be just as hard to look for $200,000 as $2 million. It's the way it plays out.
Well, here I thought the previous set of comments were good ending ones, but then you started talking about funding and money, and that's an even better note to end on, I think. So I think this is a good opportunity to thank you, our panelists, Gregg, Rob, and Erin, for the wonderful insights. I think everyone here really gained a lot from sort of the behind the scenes wisdom that you were able to share. Thank you also to NSF and IES for your participation. From the APS office, I want to be sure to credit my colleagues Kekoa Erber and Nick Gantuch, who helped organize this event. Last minute plug, if you're not planning to join, please do. Our 2021 APS virtual convention, May 26, 27, the end of next month, psychologicalscience.org/conventions. We'll be sure to email everyone who is registered for this event with a link to the video, as well as some other resources that our panelists are interested in providing. So stay tuned over the next week or two for that email to be sent to you. But in the meantime, again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you most of all to APS members and other psychological scientists who are able to join. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.